I remember the day I first met Heather. It was a cool autumn afternoon, and we were both attending a charity event hosted by Doug. I had been invited due to my work in investments, but Heather immediately caught my eye. Her laughter filled the room, drawing me toward her like a magnet. We spent the whole evening talking, sharing stories, and connecting in ways I hadn't anticipated. From that moment, I knew there was something special between us, something worth holding on to. As time went by, Heather and I became inseparable. Our relationship flourished, and after 4 years together, I felt incredibly lucky. She wasn't just my partner, she was my confidant, my best friend. We had our ups and downs like any couple, but the good times always outweighed the bad. So when Doug invited us to his New Year's Eve party at his mansion, I was thrilled. It was the perfect chance to celebrate not only the holiday, but also the life we had built together. I rang the doorbell and stepped back, waiting for Doug to answer. While we waited, I pulled Heather in for a quick hug, kissing her softly. The love I felt for her was beyond words. These past 4 years had been the happiest of my life, and tonight we were going to celebrate in style, surrounded by friends at Doug's grand New Year's party. I was eager to see Doug, but I was even more excited to spend the evening and night with my wife as we welcomed the new year. Just as I was about to ring the bell again, Doug opened the door with a grin and loudly invited us in. From the number of cars outside, I could tell it was going to be a big party, but I was still surprised by how many people were packed into his house. Doug hugged Heather tightly and kissed her cheek before pulling her inside. He then turned to me, shook my hand, and stepped aside so I could enter. A maid took our coats, disappearing with them. Doug walked between us and said, "God, I'm glad to see you two. I hate it when my parties get this big, but I feel like I have to invite everyone. Most of them are business contacts, but a few good friends like you are the ones I really want here." "Clarissa is around somewhere, probably avoiding the usual handsy crowd," he added with a chuckle. As the night went on, Heather and I danced, ate, and drank more than we probably should have. We weren't worried because we knew we had a bed upstairs. We were among the few invited to stay the night, so we didn't have to worry about driving, getting a cab, or designating a sober driver. I'm doing pretty well in the investment business, I thought to myself. In fact, I'm one of the top brokers in my office and rank high in the company. Because of this, I recognized quite a few people at the party. A lot of them, to be blunt, were available women or worse. Doug and I agreed on that. My Heather, being so beautiful, had to fend off attention just like his Clarissa did. Throughout the evening, I took the opportunity to socialize, chatting with current clients and approaching wealthier guests to potentially gain new ones. But I kept an eye on Heather, too. I trusted her completely, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little jealous. I watched her closely and sometimes had to step in when a man got too familiar. Whenever I'd rescue her at parties, Heather would smile and kiss me gently, often whispering, "Thank you," or "Thanks for saving me, honey." Tonight was no different. Several times, I saw her trying to slip away from someone who was a bit too close. Each time I got a smile, a touch, or a kiss, followed by her soft, "Thank you." We'd chat for a bit, maybe share a quick dance or drink, and then go our separate ways again. As the night went on, many guests left, leaving only those staying to ring in the new year with our host. That's when I noticed one man in particular. He seemed to be shadowing Heather, almost stalking her. He never strayed far and kept watching her. I recognized the look. He was completely taken with her, seizing every chance to stay close. At first, Heather ignored him or moved away, but as the night went on, she stayed with him longer, even smiling or laughing at what he said. Sometimes she lightly touched his arm. This wasn't like my Heather. She never flirted like that, especially not with a stranger. Doug must have noticed too, because just before midnight, he came over to me. "Stan," Doug said quietly, "the guy with Heather is Jonathan Douglas. He's bad news, a real player. I didn't invite him, but one of the women brought him as her date. I haven't seen them together since you and Heather arrived." Doug stood next to me, carefully scanning the room. A curious look crossed his face as he continued. "Actually, I think his girlfriend already left. Now that I think about it, earlier in the evening she watched him follow Heather for a bit. Then they had a pretty heated conversation. I haven't seen her since." "Stan, he's a problem," Doug warned. "Problem with a capital P. He's married, but they're separated more often than not. He goes after married women or anyone with something he wants. He's drawn to married ladies and wealthy single women, even though he's worth millions himself. You need to watch him. He could charm a nun into bed and make her think it was her idea." For the third time that night, I went over to pull Heather away from Jonathan. He gave me the same smug look as before. But this time, Heather didn't thank me. Instead, she looked frustrated and said, "Stan, what's up with you tonight? You saw I was enjoying my conversation with Jonathan. Why did you feel the need to interrupt? He's not like the usual creeps you've saved me from. He's actually interesting and has hilarious stories. He's running for mayor and was telling me about the people he deals with on his campaign. When he found out I work in public information and advertising, he asked for advice on how to get his message to voters. I think he might offer me a job." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Honey, I don't care," I said firmly. "I don't trust that guy and I don't like him around you. Doug says he's bad news and a real womanizer. I've heard things about him too, and I want you to stay safe. The job he's hinting at will probably have you working non-stop." Heather glared at me for a moment, her anger flashing. I worried I'd messed everything up, but then she smiled and leaned in to kiss me, saying, "Aw, this is cute. You're jealous, but don't worry, honey. You're all mine." As we parted to mingle, something stuck with me. She said, "You're all mine," but didn't say she was mine. That thought lingered, and 3 months later I'd recall that night in painful detail. The last 2 months had been rocky at home. Soon after the party, Heather started coming home late from meetings or visits with her parents. When I asked her about it, she'd get angry and defensive, claiming she lost track of time or had to finish something before leaving. She also began volunteering for the local Republican Party after work, which ate up more of her time. Heather is a department leader, and her skills are almost legendary. She became a volunteer office manager for the local campaign, cleaning up chaos and gaining popularity. Like many clueless husbands, I noticed our Zek's life deteriorating as she spent more time away. I faced more rejections, and when we did have Zex, it was lackluster. She now treated it like an obligation, no longer the passionate, extended lovemaking we once had. She always had an excuse: too tired, too late, or not enough time. The truth was, she used to engage willingly, even enthusiastically, but now it felt like a chore. One day, I confided in Doug about the issues in my marriage. He gave me a worried look and said, "Stan, I'm beginning to think I might have played a role in your problems. I've been hearing rumors that Jonathan is involved with another married woman. Word is, he met her at a New Year's party, and we both know where he was and who he spent that night with. She's also volunteering for his mayoral campaign." I felt lightheaded, my breath leaving me. Doug looked at me and asked, "Stan, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I sat there staring at him, then replied, "Heather started volunteering at the Republican office too, about an hour after work and on Saturdays. She always comes home late and refuses to say much about it. Every time I ask, she gets defensive or angry. When she's home, she snaps if I get close to her, and she's almost violent if I try to see her undressed or initiate anything physical." Doug leaned back and pursed his lips. After a pause, he said, "Stan, I'm going to find out what's going on, and well, let's just say I won't let him get away with it if he's been abusing my hospitality by messing with my best friend's wife. I'd be mad if he hooked up with any married woman at my party. But your wife? That's crossing the line. I should have kicked him out when his girlfriend left, but I was too focused on being a good host. If I'm the cause of your problems, I promise to make it right." I guess I should share a bit more about Doug. He's my best friend, and I'd trust him with my life. Honestly, I'd trust him alone in a room with my wife. Even if they both hadn't had Zex in a year, he'd never betray me. We're closer than brothers. Doug is smart, probably the smartest person I know. We were in the same high school class. He gave the valedictorian speech while I struggled to make the top 10 in our class of 223. He only went to college for a year before deciding it was a waste of time. He barely attended classes, never studied, but still earned a 4.0 GPA. He ended up taking just a few finance courses before teaching himself everything about investing and finance. The reason he needed to learn about it was that, during his freshman year, he inherited a little over $70,000 from his grandparents. Unlike most young people, Doug didn't blow the money. He bought a decent used truck and invested the rest in the stock market. His first 2 stock purchases were based on a broker's advice. Unsurprisingly, they were trendy picks that made money only for the broker. That made Doug furious, and he started educating himself. He watched CNBC, read books, and researched the market. Eventually, he opened a discount brokerage account online, transferred all his funds, and started trading on his own. From his first solo trade, Doug made more money than he ever did with the so-called experts. It didn't hurt that he started in the late 80s during the tech boom and dot-com craze. He got in and out of several lucrative stocks. No, he didn't profit from every trade, but he grew his wealth exponentially. He was also smart enough to move into safer stocks when the market started to decline. He bought Berkshire Hathaway shares at just over $17,000 and sold them 3 years later for $72,357 a share. By then, he was a multimillionaire and was expanding into venture capital and real estate. I graduated from college and spent 4 years working as a salesman for a restaurant chain. I didn't enjoy the travel, and I was serious about Heather, so I became a stockbroker. I managed a small part of Doug's millions. He handed me some of his investments when I was starting out, and I always suspected it was to help a friend. I felt guilty because I knew he didn't need my advice or management. It felt like charity. But Doug convinced me otherwise. His reasoning was twofold. He wanted to spread his investments across different brokerage firms for safety, and he believed I might come across valuable information that could help him. Neither of us ever considered it insider trading, but occasionally I came across something useful. We both benefited. Doug also referred many of his friends and acquaintances to me if they needed full-service brokerage, so I earned commissions from those trades. Doug didn't work for anyone else. He worked 8 to 10 hours a day for himself, researching stocks and managing his investments. He lived well and tried to bring Heather and me into his social circle. We attended countless charity events with him, often at his expense. Occasionally, I'd cover the costs since I had an expense account as a broker. Doug and I also went to political meetings and socialized with influential people. We never missed a Friday night party at Doug's house. After Doug and I talked, we had plans to attend a $500 a plate political rally with him and his girlfriend. As usual, Doug treated Heather and me. For some reason, Heather was more reluctant than usual to go with us this time. I insisted she join me, and I still regret it. Our marriage was already heading toward disaster, especially after Doug's investigators gave me their report on Heather. But that dinner marked the real beginning of the end. When we arrived, I realized we were at a reception where the state Senate candidate was speaking in support of other state and local politicians. The ticket money went to the state Republican Party, though part of it would also support local candidates. What I hadn't realized was that the guest of honor was a mayoral candidate for our city. Of course, it was Jonathan, the a-hole. As we entered, I saw Jonathan standing at the front, smiling and chatting with local dignitaries. I felt Heather pull away slightly and turned to see what was bothering her. She was staring at Jonathan, her face glowing like a woman in love. In that moment, I feared I'd lost my wife. I asked, "What's wrong?" Heather snapped out of it and gave me a faint smile. "Sorry, dear. I just didn't realize who this dinner was for." She looked so guilty that I doubted her, but I didn't say anything. She had to have known Jonathan would be there since she was working part-time at the campaign office. Now it made sense why she was so hesitant to come. I glanced over at Doug and saw he had noticed our exchange. He turned to glare at Jonathan before putting on a smile and guiding Heather to a chair. He pulled it out for her, then sat Clarissa down next to him on his left. As I walked by, Doug called out to me, "Sorry, Stan. I didn't realize he was part of the group benefiting from our generosity. When he invited you, I saw her reaction. Buddy, I hope I'm wrong, but I've got a meeting with a friend on Monday I want you to join. How about lunch around 11:30? After finishing her meal, Heather excused herself to go to the restroom. I noticed that as she stood up, Jonathan also got up and left through a different door. I hesitated for a moment, thinking about following him, but Doug placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "No, Stan, it's already being handled. And if it's true, it's too late anyway. Just wait until Monday. Please." Later that evening, I lost track of Heather again and went searching for her. When I came back from the bathroom, I snuck onto the stage and hid behind the curtain. I could hear soft moans and hushed voices. One of them was unmistakably Heather's. I felt a surge of anger and moved toward the voices, but tripped over a rope, causing some noise. I heard Heather whisper, "Oh no, someone's coming. I need to leave. Honey, it won't help if we get caught. I'll see you at the office. I love you." I heard a quick kiss, then hurried footsteps moving away. I followed, but was too late to see anything, just assuming it was Heather and Jonathan. As I walked back, I ran into Doug in the hallway. His face was dark with anger. He grabbed me and made me stop. "Damn it, Stan," he said. "I told you to leave it alone. We need to gather information before you do something rash. If she is cheating, and I think she is, we need proof. That way you can get the best deal in a divorce if that's where this heads. The way you're acting, you're only going to get screwed over by the legal system." After calming me down a bit, Doug continued, "I saw them rushing down the other corridor. They stopped at a classroom door, and she looked around for you. When she didn't see you, she got scared and told him she thought you were trying to find them. Now she's even more suspicious, and it'll be harder to get the truth. When we returned to the table, we played it cool. We made sure Heather and others saw us laughing and passing a pocket flask. As I sat next to her, Heather shot me a look and asked, "Where were you?" Just then, Clarissa walked over to Doug, gave him a hug, and smiled at us. "Okay, you two. Next time I catch you sneaking out to your car for a drink, I'll either come with you or call the cops. Now, let me have a sip from that flask." Heather seemed to relax a bit. She turned to Clarissa and asked, "Oh my God, what were they up to? I couldn't find them earlier." Clarissa laughed and replied, "Oh yeah, I tried to catch them for my share before they went inside, but as you can see, they beat me to it." Later, during the dance, I took a turn with Clarissa. She was lost in the moment, and when I tried to glance around the room, she gently stopped me, refusing to follow my lead. She kissed me on the cheek and said, "No, Stan, you don't want to look right now. Just dance with me and try to enjoy the evening. I know what you're going through, and it's only going to get worse. But remember, Doug and I are here for you, always." I relaxed a little and returned the kiss, whispering, "Thanks for stepping in earlier. I nearly lost it, and Doug thinks that would have been a big mistake. I'm so angry at this guy, I don't know what to do." The rest of the week and weekend were rough. I swung between fear and rage. Deep down, I knew Heather had emotionally left me, and it was only a matter of time before she physically left too. We hadn't been happy for weeks. I started to distance myself from her mentally, even though I wasn't certain if she had cheated. But if she hadn't, there was still something seriously wrong, because we weren't the loving couple we used to be. Finally, the day of my meeting with Doug and his friend arrived. I had a strong feeling his friend would be a private investigator. I was nervous, my stomach in knots and dealing with heartburn. Beneath the surface, I could feel my anger simmering, and I knew Doug and his friend could see it. I was both dreading what I might learn and eager to know the truth. As I approached the table, Doug stood up, shook my hand, and pulled me into a hug. After the greeting, he introduced me to his friend, Simon Hobbs, who turned out to be an investigator. We took a minute to look over the menu and place our order with the waitress. Doug then said, "Let's get this unpleasant business out of the way." He looked at Simon, then back at me. Simon opened his briefcase, pulled out a large envelope, and handed it to me. "We've been following your wife and Mr. Douglas. Per Mr. Beaver's request, the surveillance lasted for 20 days, ending last Saturday night." He continued, "During that time, we observed that they had lunch together daily, except for Sundays when she stayed home. They dined at various upscale hotels, and after each meal, they would retire to a room rented by Mr. Douglas's campaign. On 8 separate occasions, we were able to enter the room by posing as room service. Each time neither was dressed and the bed was in use. Photos and reports are included. We also recorded audio by placing a microphone under the door. They had sex during every hotel visit." Simon paused, then added, "Additionally, we recorded multiple inappropriate encounters at the campaign office and after hours. We have photographs of them engaging in sexual acts 3 times at the headquarters and once at a party with some of Mr. Douglas's supporters." He hesitated before saying, "Perhaps the worst thing we captured involved a meeting between Mr. Douglas, your wife, and Stephen Negrano, the president of the Municipal Employees Union at the Gentlemen's Club. Negrano seemed quite taken with your wife, and we have photos of her sitting on his lap while his hand was under her dress." Simon then placed a laptop on the table and played a segment of the DVD. "You'll get a copy of this in the report, but I wanted to go over this specific incident first. My operative was excited to share this information, and I believe your lawyer will be too." Doug and I leaned in to watch. In the video, Heather was sitting between Jonathan and Stephen. The 2 men leaned over her, talking, while Jonathan's hands roamed. He touched Heather's bosoms and slid his hand under her skirt. At one point, Heather whispered for him to stop, but he responded, "Heather, I can feel how excited you are. You know you like this. Just relax. It's nothing unusual at this club." Jonathan then kissed her softly. She moaned, pressing herself against him as his hand continued to move under her very short skirt. From the camera angle, it was clear she wasn't wearing underwear. After Jonathan leaned back, Stephen pulled her onto his lap. She tried to resist, but he kept pulling her in, sliding his hand under her dress and unbuttoning her top to kiss her bosoms. Heather hissed, "Stop it, Stephen." Stephen then looked at Jonathan and said, "Jonathan, you know what needs to be done if you want the union's support. I want to spend the weekend with her. If you arrange that, I'll make sure the union backs your campaign." Heather, clearly distressed, tried to get up, insisting, "No, this is not happening. Let me go." Ignoring her, Stephen raised his eyebrows at Jonathan while continuing to touch her. Jonathan swallowed hard and leaned toward Heather. He said, "Honey, we really need this. Just go with him and help me out. It'll secure our future. And it's not like you haven't done this before. Just tell your idiot husband you have a meeting this weekend." In the video, Heather looked shocked and tried to resist. But then she seemed to relax. She moaned and turned toward Jonathan, kissing him. At this point, the club manager approached their table, looking nervous. He glanced at Heather, then at the men, and stammered, "Mr. Negrano, I've overlooked a lot for you, but you're becoming too obvious. Lieutenant Jones said the chief sent detectives to the club to reduce incidents like this. If they see what's happening, they'll shut me down. Could you take this to a back room or a hotel, please? This is my livelihood." Stephen laughed and looked at one of the large men sitting across the table. He said, "Hey, Ralph, why don't you give Joe a couple thousand for his trouble? The little lady and I are heading to the DoubleTree for the weekend. Make the arrangements, okay? Just frame it as a meeting of union leaders like we usually do." I felt my anger boiling over and started to stand up. I growled, "That lying woman. She wasn't at the DoubleTree last weekend. She called me on Friday evening claiming she had been assigned to a disaster relief project for work and was flying to San Francisco." Doug and Simon quickly grabbed me and sat me back down. Simon calmly said, "Please wait, sir. I'd like to fast forward and show you one more clip. Then you can read the report in full. We have some suggestions we'd like to discuss, but I figured you might want to see the footage first." Simon continued, "My operative stopped filming at the club and sent reinforcements to the DoubleTree ahead of Stanley and Heather. Once Stanley's men checked him in, they went to the bar for a few drinks. My operatives, dressed as hotel staff, followed them into the room once it was opened. After the thugs inspected the place, my team started adjusting the pillows, flowers, and other decorations, acting like they were preparing the room." Simon smiled slightly and added, "One of the senior managers even sent an assistant downstairs for fresh flowers and more champagne, giving my operatives extra time to place hidden cameras and microphones in the main room and both bedrooms." He continued, "By the time your wife and Stanley returned to the room, they were both drunk. The cameras captured everything. I'll play some of the key footage." Simon started playing the DVD on his small computer. The video showed Heather and Stanley entering the hotel room and shutting the door. Stanley immediately leaned in to kiss her. Then with a growl, he tore her blouse open, buttons flying everywhere. He yanked it off her shoulders as Heather unzipped and let her skirt fall to the floor. Since she wasn't wearing any underwear, she was left completely undressed. She stepped out of her shoes, took Stanley's hand, giggling as she led him into the master bedroom with the king-sized bed. The footage showed Heather undressing Stanley and pushing him back onto the bed. After several minutes, another man appeared in the frame. Stanley looked up at him and smiled. The man was the city services director. The video documented Heather engaging in sexual acts with both men. Simon paused the video and looked at me. "Your wife stayed in that room until checkout on Monday morning. During that time, she had sex with all the senior managers of the Municipal Employees Union and Stanley." Late Saturday night, Jonathan Douglas himself visited the room. He, Stanley, and the city services director spent most of the night with her. We have more photos and videos of these events, including footage of them discussing plans to misuse city funds to support Jonathan's mayoral campaign. Simon continued, "We also have evidence of Senator Nussbaum and 2 judges involved in sexual acts with your wife and Jonathan. Jonathan traded her sexual favors for their support. Everything is documented." He paused before saying, "At the campaign dinner where you tried to catch them, Jonathan and your wife were planning to have sex on stage. He had already pulled her dress down below her bosoms and removed her underwear. He was about to start when she heard you and made him stop. That's when they ran. We have photos of that as well. It's probably best you didn't cause a scene, as the photos could have made things worse for you." Simon handed me a copy of the full report. "We can provide this to your lawyer if you wish. Our investigation fees include any local court testimony, should it be necessary. I'd also recommend we continue monitoring for potential criminal charges. If we give the FBI and local authorities evidence of the misuse of campaign funds and conspiracy, they're more likely to take the case seriously. Plus, if you proceed with divorce and your wife ends up facing legal trouble, you'll have a much better chance at a favorable settlement." Even though I knew this was coming, I was still upset and shocked. I couldn't believe the level of depravity and disrespect my wife had shown while under surveillance. The report revealed that she believed she was in love with Jonathan. They were actively discussing how and when she would leave me. She was even ranting about the job she'd been promised in Jonathan's administration if he were elected mayor. What shocked me the most was her willingness to spend a weekend at the DoubleTree, doing sexual acts for Jonathan and his friends, acts she had always refused to do with me. On several occasions, she even initiated sex later in the weekend during their private sessions. I always knew Heather was ambitious and admired powerful people, but I never imagined the lengths she'd go to for success. I felt physically ill. I barely ate, and I noticed Doug wasn't eating much either. After the investigator left, Doug and I sat quietly for a while, drinking in silence. Eventually, Doug said, "Stanley, I'm so sorry I ruined your marriage. I take full responsibility for what's happened and intend to make it right. I know I can't undo what's been done, but I'll help you however I can. I'll find you a great divorce lawyer and support you until you're back on your feet." I got up from the table and looked at Doug. "Well, start looking for that lawyer. I was about to give Heather an ultimatum. Either she straightens up or we get divorced, even before I knew for sure she was cheating. But now after seeing this, I can't believe it. I wonder when she changed, or if I just never really knew her at all. As for the rest, you know as well as I do that Heather's betrayal isn't your fault. You don't owe me anything." On Thursday, Doug called me. "Hey, Stan, I found you a real shark of a lawyer. She hates cheaters and always fights for the innocent in divorce cases. She despises public figures and businessmen who use their power to manipulate women. If we play this right, you won't just get rid of Heather and keep most of your assets, but we can also take Jonathan down." Doug gave me the name and contact information of the lawyer he recommended. I called her later that day to set up a consultation. When I told her assistant who I was, she said they'd been expecting my call and scheduled me for a 9 a.m. meeting the next morning. I agreed and received a list of documents and information to bring with me. When I arrived the next morning, I was immediately shown to her office. I was impressed with my new lawyer, and we quickly got into a conversation about my goals for the divorce. I told her, "I want to dissolve this marriage and keep all our property, though I know that's unlikely. I also want to go after this wife-stealing prick for everything we can. I want to ruin his chances in the mayoral race and leave him broke." Sally, my lawyer, leaned back in her chair, rocking slightly as she thought. Then she smiled and asked, "Are you sure you want to go all out? Or do you want to financially destroy him, ruin his reputation, and potentially send him to prison? With the right moves, we can likely get him jailed. I've already reviewed parts of the investigator's report, and it's incredibly damaging. Sorry to say, but this case is so egregious that we could take down most of the key players involved. In fact, I'm legally obligated to hand over the report to the authorities because they've violated several federal laws. If we go to the authorities first and then file for divorce, we'll shot him harder. If you file first, he might find a way to escape or avoid punishment for a while." I replied, "I don't care what we do to him and the others who slept with Heather. As painful as this is, I know Heather is the one responsible for all of this. But she couldn't have done it without him. From the moment I saw him meet her, I knew he was the one pursuing her. He kept after her until she gave in and ended up in his bed. It takes two to tango. She always wore her wedding ring, so he knew she was married. I even heard them on tape, talking about her stupid husband and planning how to treat me. When the time came for the big breakup, Sally and I worked through her questions, and I made a firm decision. I told her to prepare and filed the divorce papers immediately. We also agreed that the private investigator's report should be handed over to the FBI right away to trigger an investigation into campaign law violations and the misuse of union and city funds. Sally suggested I contact the process server to serve Heather and threaten legal action against Jonathan Douglas. She warned, "If he's like most politicians, he might threaten you with physical damage, try to get you fired, or even countersue if you persist. He may also attempt to negotiate secretly and offer you a bribe. If that happens, and depending on the source of his funds, we could strike him with additional campaign law violations. Politicians often divert campaign money for personal use, and I wouldn't be surprised if he tries to do that." Sally then pulled out a tiny microphone and a recorder. "I want you to keep these with you at all times. Wear the microphone hidden in your hair and keep the voice recorder in your car. The transmitter has a range of about 1 kilometer, but even if you're out of range, the recorder will capture up to 6 hours of audio. It will automatically download the recordings when you're back within range of your car. If you give me your car keys, I'll have someone install a dash cam while we finish here." She also advised, "Consider rehiring a private investigator or let me hire one to continue watching your wife and Mr. Douglas. I've heard rumors that your wife isn't the first woman he's seduced, and he's used illegal means to cover things up in the past. If we can catch him discussing plans or trying to manipulate the situation, we can really nail him and your wife." I smiled and said, "The private investigator I hired gave me similar advice. I still have him on retainer." The next Thursday, Sally called. "Mr. Malone, we're ready to file for divorce and serve your wife. Do you still want to follow the plan and attend when she's served?" "Absolutely. At least that I'll get some satisfaction out of it." I thought about it and suggested, "What if we serve her tomorrow night at campaign headquarters? Wouldn't that be a good time?" Sally was silent for a moment and then said, "No, Stan, that wouldn't be a good idea. If you serve her there and make a scene, everyone at the office will know immediately, and word will spread fast. If that happens, Jonathan might lose the election, but he won't feel pressured to bribe or negotiate with you. It's better to serve her when she's either alone or with him. Ideally, when they're alone." "Okay, I get your point. How about we follow them tomorrow night? Heather usually doesn't get home until midnight on Fridays, and the investigators' report said they often spend Friday nights alone in a hotel room. It's usually the same one they use during lunch. Couldn't we serve them room service and catch them in the act?" Sally agreed to hire a process server to interrupt their Friday night hotel rendezvous. When I arrived at my office, 2 men in suits were waiting for me. They introduced themselves and asked to talk about how I was managing some funds for their widowed mother. I smiled and invited them in. Once the door was closed, they showed me their FBI badges. They explained they were working on Jonathan's case based on the materials my lawyer had sent over. When they found out I planned to use a process server and record the interaction, they asked me to wear one of their devices to capture the conversation. This request made me uneasy, as I had been considering how I might make some side money off of Jonathan, my winnings, so to speak. But I couldn't come up with a good reason to refuse, so I agreed to wear their wire too. That evening, we all followed the 2 lovebirds from campaign headquarters to the hotel. They left around 7 p.m. and were in the room by 7:30. There were so many of us it felt like a parade, and I worried we'd be spotted. After they got to the hotel, we waited for almost an hour. I had the foresight to bring my camera to capture everything. I'm not usually into home movies, but in this case, I made an exception. We were just about to knock on the door when a fortunate coincidence occurred. The elevator doors opened, and a room service waiter came out, pushing a cart full of dishes. He walked toward the room and gave us a questioning look. I smiled, pointed at the door, and said, "Go ahead, be our guest. We didn't mean to interrupt Mr. Douglas's dinner. We'll just step aside for a moment." The waiter smiled and said, "No problem." He knocked on the door, and when Jonathan asked who it was, the waiter replied, "Room service." The door opened, and the waiter entered. The process server and I stayed out of sight, waiting for the waiter to leave. As he opened the door to exit, I moved forward to keep it from closing. The process server and I quietly slipped into the room, staying out of view. We waited until Jonathan and Heather started their dinner before fully entering. I was ahead of the process server when we walked in, and the sight before me was shocking and heartbreaking. Despite the detective's report, seeing it in person was far worse. Heather and Jonathan were completely undressed, sitting at a table with their meal laid out. They had ordered appetizers, dessert, and wine. Heather was sitting on Jonathan's lap, her back to him, as they fed each other while having sex. They looked completely lost in their own world, kissing tenderly as they enjoyed each other's company. I began filming as we turned the corner. Finally, I gave the process server a nod and he stepped forward. He asked, "Are you Jonathan Douglas and Heather Malone?" Heather screamed, jumped off Jonathan's lap, and ran to the bed, grabbing a hotel robe to cover herself. Jonathan cursed and stood up angrily. He growled, "Yeah, I'm Jonathan. Get the hell out of my room. How did you even get in here?" The process server replied calmly, "The room service waiter let us in. Didn't you hear us ask if we could enter? I thought you invited us." He then walked further into the room and handed Heather the divorce papers, saying, "You've been served." I stepped forward, and Heather finally noticed me. "Stan, damn you, what are you doing here? And what's all this talk about divorce? If you don't stop this nonsense, I'll ruin you. You'll have nothing, and I'll take everything." I looked at her calmly and said, "No, Heather, you won't. In fact, if you know what's good for you, you'll sign the papers and accept my terms. When I'm done with you, I'll deal with your lover. I'm filing a lawsuit against him for mental cruelty and alienation of affection. Luckily, we live in a state where those lawsuits are still allowed. This could also hurt his election chances. To be blunt, you've been played, and now it's your turn to face the consequences. Heather didn't bother going home that night. I didn't see or hear from her until the following Wednesday when she called me at work. She didn't apologize or make small talk. As soon as I answered, she said, "Jonathan and I want to meet with you to settle this mess. We've booked a conference room at the hotel for tonight. Be there at 7. She didn't ask if I could come. She simply commanded it. I called Sally and told her about the call, then contacted my FBI contact. Sally insisted I go, and both she and the FBI would be there to support me in case things went sideways. When I arrived at the hotel, I asked the receptionist where the meeting was and was led down a hallway to a small conference room. A large man stood guard at the door. As I tried to enter, he stopped me. "There's a private meeting going on, sir," he said. "I know," I replied. "I'm Stan Malone, and I'm supposed to be here." After checking my ID, the guard knocked on the door. The door opened slightly, and he said, "Mr. Malone is here, sir." I couldn't hear the response, but the door closed again. The guard turned to me and said, "I'll need to search you, sir. Please empty your pockets into this tray." I emptied my pockets, and he patted me down. I was getting irritated and asked why I was being searched. The guard smirked and said, "Well, sir, political figures have been known to attract assassins, and Mr. Douglas doesn't want to take any risks." I suspected they were really searching for a wire or recording device, but didn't question it further. Fortunately, I had hidden the tiny transmitters in my long hair, glued to my head. After the search, I waited another 5 minutes before they finally opened the door and allowed me into the conference room. When I walked into the room, I saw Heather sitting at the table, looking directly at me. She looked guilty, her face and chest flushed. When she shifted in her seat, I realized she wasn't wearing any underwear. Then I glanced at Jonathan, and I nearly lost control. His eyes were gleaming, and he had a smug grin on his face, clearly gloating about having just slept with my wife. The meeting went exactly as Sally and I had anticipated. Jonathan started by threatening to get me fired from my job, and then he escalated to threats of physical damage unless I gave Heather a better deal and dropped my plans to sue him and his campaign. I leaned back in my chair and calmly said, "Listen, I know you and your cronies might be able to damage or even eliminate me, but that won't save you. I've taken precautions. If anything happens to me or my family, even an accident, several packages will be sent out automatically. You know as well as I do that not all media can be controlled, and some will publish the information, especially if I'm seriously hurt or eliminated. You'll be finished." I watched Jonathan's face fill with anger, and I saw that familiar tension in Heather's expression that meant she was furious. Smiling, I continued, "I know exactly what you were doing before I walked in here, and I have photos of you doing it several times before. In fact, I have photos and recordings from your meeting last week with union leaders and senior city officials at the hotel. Do you really think they'll thank you for dragging them into this mess? If anything happens to me, the paperwork being mailed out will expose them, Heather and you. Some of these people, let's just say, aren't ones you want to cross." Heather glared at me, while Jonathan, looking a bit sick, tried to maintain his composure. He snapped, "You heard what I said. Stop your threats and end this quietly, or else—" His voice grew colder as he glared at me. "Now get out of my room!" I smiled and leaned forward. "You know, Jonathan, I might reconsider everything if I were confident in a fair divorce settlement from my wife," I said calmly. "But if this town's idiots elect you, they'll get what they deserve." I stood up, maintaining eye contact with Jonathan until he looked uneasy. I could tell it took all his effort not to look away. I chuckled softly and turned toward the door. Before leaving, I glanced back and said, "Oh, by the way, Jonathan, things are going to get very uncomfortable for you soon." Without waiting for a response, I walked out. When I got home, I found my private investigator waiting in the driveway with the FBI agent. They were ready to debrief me. After removing their microphones and packing up the equipment, the investigator smiled and said, "We got it all. After you left, Jonathan ordered his people to put you under surveillance and dig up anything they could use against you. You really rattled him." 3 days later, I followed up with Sally about the divorce. After some discussion, I brought up Jonathan. "Sally, I'm done waiting for this idiot. I told him and Heather what it would take for me to walk away, and they're still blocking me. Let's get aggressive. File the lawsuit against Jonathan. I think we should go for $10 million in damages." Sally paused to consider, then said, "Let's do it. That'll definitely get his attention and make headlines." As I left Sally's office and got into my car, I noticed one of Jonathan's thugs following me. He stepped back, grabbed his phone, and started gesturing wildly while talking. He must have overheard my conversation about the lawsuit. That evening, Jonathan called me, his voice filled with controlled fury. "Listen, idiot," he began, trying to sound calm. "Heather and I talked about the meeting, and we've decided to give you some of what you want. She'll sign the divorce papers without any changes, and she'll walk away with only her personal assets and quit her job. As for me, I'm willing to settle out of court. I'll make sure there's a voluntary settlement agreement if you promise to keep quiet about all this." I couldn't help but laugh. "Jonathan, I can promise you that I won't be the one to leak anything. But I can't control what others might do. There are probably hundreds of people who know by now that you're sleeping with my wife." There was a tense silence on the other end before Jonathan spoke again, frustrated. "Fine. I'll offer you $1 million, no questions asked, if you sign a non-disclosure agreement. Heather will hand over the signed divorce papers with your proposed terms." I shook my head, amused. "Jonathan, I just told my lawyer to file a $10 million lawsuit. You'll have to offer a lot more than $1 million to make me drop it. Heck, I could probably make more than that from book and movie deals about this story." Jonathan cursed under his breath before speaking again. "Okay, $1.7 million. That's my final offer. I'll find a way to cover it in the campaign books, but that's the best I can do." "All right, Jonathan, but you better act fast. I won't stop my lawyer until I see the money in my bank account. Here's a Cayman Islands account number." What I didn't tell him was that the account was set up in his name using his address. I hoped federal investigators would find it and trace the money from his campaign. Once the funds arrived, I planned to transfer them immediately to make sure they couldn't be taken back. Later that evening, my doorbell rang. The same guy who guarded the door during my meeting with Jonathan and Heather stood there, holding a clipboard with a one-page legal document. "Mr. Douglas asked me to bring this for your signature," he said. I glanced at it and smirked. "Looks fine, but I need my lawyer to review it first." The man frowned. "I shouldn't leave without it." I sighed and shut the door. In my office, I called Sally, explained the situation, and she agreed to come over. After an hour, she smiled after reviewing the papers and told me to sign. 3 days later, I found $1.7 million in the Cayman Islands account. That same day, my lawyer informed me Heather had signed the uncontested divorce papers, which were filed and would be final in 30 days. I quickly transferred the money internationally, moving it between banks under a fictitious name in case Jonathan tried to get it. During this time, my work suffered. My commissions dropped to half, and I struggled to focus. Colleagues often had to cover for me and earned commissions on my clients' sales. Even after the divorce was finalized, I was still distracted, making costly mistakes at work. Worse, I couldn't stop worrying that Jonathan or his friends would retaliate. One night, the doorbell rang after 9 p.m. Heather stood there crying with a fresh bruise on her face. "Stan," she whispered, "can I talk to you?" I almost shut the door but hesitated. I let her in, leading her to my office. She sat, still crying, then finally spoke. "Stan, I know it's too late, but I wanted to apologize. I realized what a huge mistake I made. Jonathan knew exactly how to manipulate me. I fell for him, and the job he promised after the election made me lose sight of us." Her sobs intensified. "I was furious with you on New Year's Eve when you tried to separate us. I was already late when you pulled me away from Jonathan. He had convinced me to sleep with him less than 3 hours after we met. I'm so sorry." Heather's voice trembled as she described how, after just a few weeks of sneaking around, she became convinced she had to fully support Jonathan. He promised to leave his wife and marry her after the election, claiming it would hurt his campaign to do it sooner. She got caught up in the dream of being a mayor's wife, and maybe even a senator's or governor's, losing touch with reality. That evening, she found Jonathan with a young campaign volunteer. "You were right, Stan," she said bitterly. "He fed her the same lies he told me. When I confronted him, he laughed and said, 'What makes you think I'd marry an old strumpet like you, especially one with a history of cheating and sleeping around?' She angrily wiped her tears and added, 'He said if I behaved, I could stay as his social secretary and entertain his important friends like before.' Sobbing, she continued, 'I slapped him and he punched me. He's ruined everything, Stan. And I know it's too late, but I wanted to apologize for what I did to us. If you can forgive me, I'd love to try again.' She gave me a hopeful, regretful look, kissed me on the cheek, and left. I watched her car speed off and sighed, wishing she'd realized all this before everything fell apart. In the days that followed, I couldn't bear to stay in the house. The memories were too painful. I listed it for sale and hired an agent to help me find a new place, somewhere free of the past. I brought in movers and a crew to clean up. Occasionally, I called Doug or Sally for updates. They told me the feds had taken over the investigation, suspecting corruption in the local police. They agreed to keep my name out of it unless absolutely necessary, and Sally reassured me the feds had enough evidence to honor that agreement. About 6 weeks later, I woke up to news that the feds had arrested everyone involved in Jonathan's scheme. They were charged with corruption, campaign violations, and racketeering. Jonathan was arrested for misusing funds and selling promises of future appointments. Surprisingly, or not, Heather was also arrested for her role. I called Sally, but all she knew was that leaks had come from other sources, not me. Everything was falling into place, and the money Jonathan paid me was safe. I couldn't help but smile, remembering how I had carefully planted incriminating documents while looking for Heather. After talking to Sally, I sat back, finally at peace. I had my revenge on Jonathan, freed myself from my unfaithful wife, and had $1.7 million to start over. Now I was free to begin a new life, find someone truly worthy, and maybe even start a family.